Well, good morning, everybody. It is good to be here with you all. You are my first live speaking event, not on Zoom. So if I'm awkward, please do cut me a little slack here. It's good to be with you to talk a little bit about my work and some thoughts on inclusive growth, which has been a real sort of pillar of my work for many, many, many years. Um, I will say it's the New York Times article that I wrote is actually kind of a little bit of the foundation for today's talk. I am a born again Texan. I grew up in Beaumont, Texas, went to UT Austin, and then spent about 20 years away in New York. I was a faculty member at NYU, and then have come back to the University of Texas, and as was mentioned at the LBJ School. And so when I was given the opportunity to sort of think about our state and what's happening in our state, what's really interesting, and I think most of you know this because you see this on the ground, is our state really represents a lot of the things that you're starting to see across the country. And so I wrote this article in the New York Times. I got about 13,000 hate emails. It was, by the way, the most read article in the New York Times that week. So my mom was really quite proud of that. But I think one of the things to think about is that what's great about your work and our work that we're doing here, both in Central Texas, but also across the state, is really, in a sense, setting a platform and a foundation for how I think others will think about economic growth going forward. And so what I want to do today is share a little bit about sort of what I see in terms of the changing demographics of Texas. I think it's extremely important to go back and just reflect on what we see as changes, what the impact of the pandemic looks like, both good and bad, right? There's been some positives and some challenges. And then since I've been back in Texas, have been giving a lot of thought about what metropolitan policy should look like. What should regional policy look like? What should be the things that you all are doing, and how that should really influence our work. And hopefully at some point we start to get the attention of our state leaders and our leaders in the legislature to actually get them to understand that inclusivity is an important part of economic development going forward. So with that said, when I wrote the New York Times article, one of the things that which was very, very interesting, the editor and I was going back and forth on this piece a lot, and he says, well, isn't California really the folks, shouldn't California be the place that we look for to give us a really good sense of what's happening across the country? And in fact, if you follow development, particularly on the national stage, we're always thinking about what's happening in California as the prediction. And so I said, that's actually an interesting question. Let's go back and look at the data. And as Texans, we love this comparison between California and Texas, right? It's looking really good for us in terms of the things that we're starting to see. And so what's really interesting about our state, in reflection to California, is that if you think about California's boom was actually really between 1980 and 1990. However, since then, if you look at the state's growth, what's actually happened is actually California has actually trailed the U.S. And in fact, it is states like ours that have actually been the predictor of what's happening in growth. And so the thesis that I had in the Times piece, if you had a chance to read it, was that Texas becomes a really interesting model for other places to think about, because as we grow, so does the U.S., and as the United States becomes more urban, so do we. As the United States becomes more diverse, so do we. And so one of the things to think about is this interesting growth model, which we've kind of developed here, and asking the question, is that a growth model for us going forward? Sorry, this clicker is a little. All my slides are the PDF. Pardon the slides. I actually looked a little bit better than here. What's interesting here, I think, again, is this idea that are we more diverse and are we more urban than ever before? The answer is yes. So let's think about the growth here. From 2000 to 2020, our state's added about 8.2 million residents, right? So that is the idea of thinking about a 40% growth rate. That's 2 times the U.S. average. So as we're dealing with the questions of equity and inclusion and growth and how to manage that growth, there's this concept of urban metabolism. We're actually having to deal with these challenges on a treadmill, right? We're running with these in dealing with these issues very, very quickly. If you think about the state of Texas, we had about 1,000 new residents every day. What's amazing about that growth, again, is that if you think about the diversity of that growth, and this is a headline that I think we all have heard over and over in the last few months, is 95% of our growth has been people of color. But what's really interesting for someone like me, and maybe for like you, who care about metropolitan policy and urban policy and regional collaboration, much of that growth is happening in our metro areas. 9 in 10 Texans now live in metros. Nearly all of the growth across the state of Texas has actually happened in urban areas. And if you look at the growth of rural communities, in fact, the growth of rural Texas is actually just about less than 1%. So we are becoming much more diverse, much more urban. Now, what's really powering that growth in sort of understanding that the growth engine of Texas, it really comes back to the idea of the Texas Triangle, which we sit a part of. And that is everything from San Antonio to Austin to Houston to Dallas, Fort Worth. About 35 million people expected to live in the Texas Triangle by 2050. It's about 1.2 billion of all economic impact in the state. And if you want to understand the size of the economy, I think this is a really important piece. If we took the Texas Triangle out of Texas and we placed it as its own economy in the world, it's just about the 15th largest economy in the world. It's about the size of Spain or Mexico. And what's really fascinating about that, obviously, is this idea of becoming a much more knowledge-based, world-class, creative economy that is quite innovative, but also exposing lots of challenges and divides in our community as we go forward. So as our economy has even powered forward, as we've become much more innovative, frankly, we also know that the pandemic has sort of reshaped some of those communities and our economies. So I think one of the things that is a foundation for what you're doing here today is this question about how do we build back a more inclusive and an even better Texas as we go forward. Three crises to think through, right? Obviously, the impact of the pandemic, the economic fiscal crisis of that, and then, frankly, the calls for racial injustice have really, in a sense, shaped the way that many of us as economic developers, as community advocates, as workforce developers are having to think about the influences of our work and how that will go forward on the future. So I think if we talk about the good, there are some things to outline to think about the impact of the economy. The first is, and I think this is the most interesting for me, is that the pandemic has really accelerated the drive to a talent-based economy. So where maybe communities and cities and regions were all mostly focused on the chasing of enterprises and businesses, what's happened in the pandemic is now we've seen this acceleration to a freelance economy or to a talent-driven economy. That is that people with skills, people with access that are educated, are very, very, in a sense, mobile and making location decisions like they haven't had opportunity to do in the past. So we've accelerated this shift to a talent-based economy. The second thing I think we have to understand is the power of remote work, and that is that remote work has changed the ballgame. Before the pandemic, there was this great experience. Did remote work actually work? Well, we did. We made it work for a couple of years for some, obviously for others creating challenges. But what's interesting about remote work going forward is that about 20% of the American workforce will continue to work remotely permanently. That's a big impact if you're thinking about your downtowns, your community, your commercial districts, what your commercial footprints look like in your communities. In addition to that 20% that's going to work full-time remotely, another 25% of us are going to work remotely 1 or 2 days a week. So that has significant ramifications by the way we think about our city building and the way we think about community development going forward and how we create community. It also raises lots of concerns as we think about what does that mean in terms of equity, inclusion, and community building. Because we, in a sense, become a community of those that have the access to remote work as a perk and privilege and others who are not. And so we're starting to create not only different classes of work and skills, but also in the sense of two segments of the workforce, a remote work, educated workforce, and folks that are maybe more service-oriented driven that have to go into the workforce every day. So this question about what that looks like and how do we think about that going forward. And then finally, I think the thing to think about is places like Pflugerville and others, and particularly here in Central Texas, where we've done a lot of investment in terms of quality of place, that raises that positions us quite well for the talent attraction wars that are happening going forward. But it also, in a sense, continues to accentuate the divides that we face. And so that's one of the things I think as we think about our work, we have to consider to think this about going forward. But as we know, right, there are things to think about. So the picture for Texas is quite rosy. We're diverse, we're urban, we're metropolitan, we're becoming more skilled than before, but there's a lot of challenges that we present. Less than a third of our workforce are college educated. We know that 2 in 10 Texans don't have access to health insurance. We know that if you look at where the impact of COVID, it hit Black and Hispanic communities much harder than other places, other communities. And so there is this interesting divide that we face as we go forward. So good things coming out of the pandemic particularly, but also some challenges as we look to the future as well. And so the thing I'm most excited, I say all of this and present all of this as background, because one of the things I want to share with you are some ideas that potentially we can think through as we want to think about a more resilient and equitable Texas. I've had the great opportunity to work with some really smart folks, and so the ideas I'm going to share with you today are not all my ideas, but a lot of my colleagues. I did a recovery resiliency plan with former Senator Kirk Watson when he was the dean at the Hobby School. He and I wrote this piece together. You'll see some of those ideas together. And then the piece that I'm really proud of is a Metropolitan Blueprint project we brought at the LBJ School, the Bush Institute, as well as the Kinder Institute in Houston, very much looking at this Texas Triangle and asking the question, what are policies and ideas for if we're wanting to build more inclusive metropolitan areas across the state of Texas? Basically making the call that as you all know, regionalism is important, but as the Texas urbanizes, we have to really, in a sense, understand that we're not the frontier state which we used to be. We're not a rural state anymore. We are very much a metro and urban state, and there are implications for that. So what are some things to think about? And I apologize for the slide format here. So first is, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that Texas urbanism has to be developed by Texans. And I say that because there are ways of thinking about our governance here in the state of Texas that is much different from a New York or a California or even other places across the country. The way we think about growth, the way we think about the idea of building coalitions means that our way of thinking through how to address these will be different than some of our other places. We can look to best practices, but obviously have to think through how that has implications for the state of Texas. Secondly, there is this need to think about the empowerment of local communities. One of the things that is fascinating about the state of Texas, and I wrote about this in Texas Monthly in late summer, was the one thing that fascinates me as an urbanist is that Texas for a long time had been a very limited government type of place, a place where what worked in Beaumont, Texas may not work in Pflugerville and may not work in Texarkana, but we were okay about letting our communities experiment and create ideas that worked for their communities. Unfortunately, we've moved away from that a bit in our state politics. And so the call for this idea of wanting to come back to this idea where organizations like yours can come together to craft regional solutions that are challenging in addressing the issues that we're facing locally is really, really important. So empowering local communities to create networks like this. And then finally, and this is something that you'll see throughout much of my work, is that we have been a state of expansion. We've been a state where we try to go out and get the Californians to move here, the New Yorkers to move here. We look for the Californian businesses. But I would submit to you from a state that we have not done enough to invest in local Texans and to connect them with the opportunities that we're trying to create here. So there's a call for this idea of saying that there's this need to invest better back in local Texans. So I'm going to share with you 10 ideas. These are Steve Pedigo's ideas. They're not rocket science, but I'm happy. Hopefully set some foundation for some conversation. So the first is investing in partnerships like yours. Your organizations, your regions are super important, are super important to us, and so we need more of this. We need more regionalism. We need more of Pflugerville working with Austin and Austin working with San Marcos and other places. We've got to create these partnerships. It is the only way by which we address our growth patterns going forward. We can't do this alone. So it's about thinking about collaborations. If you're thinking about the challenges of remote work and what that creates as opportunity, both challenges for communities, it's really going to require cities and regions and suburban areas to actually think about creating this idea of a shared value. And we can't do enough around regionalism to think about the importance of that. Secondly, we have to foster resilience through diversification. And this has been a big piece of the work that I'm doing with lots of communities across the country, as well as for a long time, we thought that we could solve our equity challenges through just creating local sector jobs, retail jobs, hospitality jobs, right? Also important service-based jobs, not thinking about how we take our exported traded economies, advanced manufacturing, technology, others, and say, how do we create opportunities for others that don't necessarily have the skills? How do we create pathways, workforce opportunities to connect those residents into those jobs? So we have to think about diversification in a way that's different. We have to think about traded sector work, not just about competitiveness, but the opportunity that that certain sectors offer, and ask our questions. If we're investing in those sectors, how do we hold the leaders, our institutions, our companies, and our enterprises accountable for creating that opportunity that we expect in our community? So diversification is really important. Moving beyond attraction and really thinking about the investment again back in innovation. I'm working on another piece now for Monthly, Texas Monthly, and if you catalog what's been very, very interesting about the growth of our state is that we again have been a state that's very much focused on let's attract, but where do we have a statewide policy where we're saying let's invest in Texas enterprises to scale and to grow, to build that innovation? It's a completely, that is what California does well, right? Which we don't do as well. That's a lesson learned for us if we want to think more about that. And then creating the access to that as well. Thirdly, investing in the work of skills of Texans. This is critically important work of Tamara and others, aligning workforce development and economic development opportunities together. It doesn't sound like rocket science, but it's extremely challenging to get employers to be accountable, to feel like they can build those relationships, using technology as different ways to think through that, ensuring that we've got the wraparound services to make sure that residents can participate in these as well. Supporting essential workers. The idea and definition of essential workers has completely changed. I think one of the things that I would come back to is I think the one lesson learned both on the knowledge-based side of the economy, service-based economy, as well as just thinking about equity generally as a larger piece, is that the importance of childcare. I was doing roundtable discussion. I'm doing the economic development plan for the city of Tucson. And the one issue that came up over and over in the city of Tucson yesterday in our 6 hours of roundtable discussions was about the importance of childcare and the importance that as economic development professionals, maybe we never thought about childcare or healthcare as essential to our economic development ecosystem, but now they really are. It's important about creating those types of opportunities. So thinking about these complete wraparound services that are really important as well. Finally, 5.5 is really around healthcare. We're a state that maybe should be thinking much more about how we align healthcare and our economic development needs together. And in fact, I think if you think through one of the lessons learned through the pandemic is that public health and economic health cannot be divorced. They have to be together. And so if we're thinking about healthcare going forward and thinking about economic development going forward, the question is how do we use healthcare as a way to catalyze development in many of our communities, using that to create jobs and pipelines, ensuring that we're thinking about new types of healthcare solutions, and really, in a sense, going back and understanding how the two are very much married together. The 6 point's a very interesting point. We are a state that is known as an energy state. We are a state that has been a big oil and energy production, but we're also the 5th largest producer of wind. And if you look at Central Texas, we are now very proud to call Tesla home to our region and other energy providers. If you look at Houston and San Antonio, big wins there as well. But there is still this need to really embrace the energy transition from an economic development perspective. And thinking through how do we really use this to catalyze new types of jobs going forward. So thinking through the different types of capabilities, thinking through what that looks like in workforce development issues. The reality is this: energy transition is coming. We can't stop it. We can't stop the implications of climate change. And so as economic developers and as policymakers, we might as well embrace the issue now and start to think about how we wrap our hands around creating economic opportunity that can advance our residents forward. If not, many of our residents across the state of Texas will get left behind and fall further and further and further behind. That's a true statement and that's a fact. But it's so this question around how we embrace the energy transition. By the way, it was mentioned that I teach college freshmen. Fascinating group. they're also a dirty group of individuals as well. Uh, I got a booster shot the other day, and I was telling the pharmacist I felt like I'm cutting a line, and I was like, I teach college freshmen. The pharm tech was like, I totally get it. I understand why you're here. Um, but this is the issue they care the most about. Many of our young, talented residents, from a skill perspective, they care so much about climate change and what that means for creating jobs and equity. And so as a state that has a real rich history and energy, we'd be silly to push this aside and not embrace this as an economic development driver going forward, because these are going to create the new types of jobs that we're looking to have in the future. Finally, thinking through promoting of rural areas, we can't forget rural areas. So 3 million Texans, by the way, that live in rural areas. If you look at the population of that, that actually, it would be the 18th largest state in the country. So it's larger than the District of Columbia and other places and other states that you would think there. So it's a lot of folks that live in smaller communities. Again, this is one of the things I think organizations like yours, thinking about not just the urban core, but even the exurban areas and rural areas. How do we connect rural communities to metropolitan communities? IC Squared at UT Austin and Art Markman and his team have done a lot to think about these issues. We can't solve the issues of rural Texas by just continuing to think about hospitality jobs, travel, tourism, and others. We actually have to build real economies and connections to metro economies. And so there's some real new thinking about what this looks like. And so not forgetting that rural communities are an important part of our growth plan going forward as a state. I told you I had 10 ideas. We're on number 8. This is an issue, engaging our community colleges and universities as community hubs. I will say community colleges are way better about this than Texas institutions. I love teaching at the University of Texas. I'm a proud alum of the University of Texas. But we at UT Austin are, I would argue, could be a better anchor. And that means ensuring that we're doing our part in being engaged in our communities. And so, there is a large field of anchor development practice across the country that has looked at the role of universities and community colleges as economic drivers, thinking of lots of different levers that these institutions can do. We in Texas have been slower to do this in other places. And so looking to think about how we engage our community anchors in a way to move our communities forward is really important. And not just, by the way, in an urban or metropolitan sense, but even in a rural sense. I've got 15 amazing LBJ students this semester that is looking at the idea of anchor-based institutions in rural economy work. We're working with SFA and the UT Permian Basin to think about what that looks like. There's a lot of work to be done in this area for the state of Texas, and it's a lot of low-hanging fruit that if we were just to think about how you leverage the power of these institutions from a place-based perspective, you could really catalyze many of our local economies going forward. Local purchasing, all those types of things have become really important to that as well. Point 9, if you're a city builder, reimagining what our commercial and downtown districts will look like. Hugely important. Again, if you think about the implications of remote work, what does that look like? I say that to say that as we think about remote work, here's the important point of that. Going forward, remote work is not going to be just working from your house or from your apartment or from your basement. Remote work is going to require an ecosystem that fosters inclusion and social interaction and community development. So as economic developers and community developers, we have to think about what that looks like going forward and being very, very intentional about how we're doing that. And that also will require us to rethink about how we look at space and think about the use of underutilized space as well. And then finally, the last point to share with you is just getting to this idea that equitable place development is critically important. Thinking about how we think through reimagining these spaces, being focused on affordability, and we could give a whole nother talk about the need for affordability and land use planning and those, but really ensuring that if we're going to practice inclusive economic development from a skills development perspective and a firm development perspective, we also have to match the land use planning and our placemaking efforts with that as well to ensure that we're building communities going forward. I end today with one of my favorite Jane Jacobs quote. Jane Jacobs, you all know Jane Jacobs, particularly of her work. And this quote is wonderful. It's so nice. It's that if cities have the capability of providing everybody something for everyone, when they're created by everyone, which means thinking as we're thinking about these challenges and working with our communities, it's really important to ensure that we're engaging all different types of folks to the table, not just our traditional suspects, and thinking about a much broader table to do that. So with that, I'll stop. I look forward to your questions. I think that's the most interesting part of today's discussion. Thanks so much. Yeah, of course. Make the questions hard. Just don't be as nasty as the New York Times comments or the hate email comments I got. My husband's like, are these people going to figure out where we live? I was like, I don't really know. It's actually an interesting question.
Steve, TJ Costello, Texas Comptroller's Office. Question. We know Texas is growing, but with over half the counties actually losing population in the last census. Is this a problem? What do we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is for metropolitan areas, right? I think it is so let's talk about the positives, right? I think the positives for us in terms of our metropolitan communities is that we are seeing the acceleration of our communities, our economic, all the great things that we heard about earlier here in Pflugerville. That is replicated in many of the Texas metros across the state. I say that saying, though, that as you look at policies that come out of our state legislature, many of the policies that continue to come out of the state legislature tend to be very anti-urban and anti-metropolitan, frankly. And so in that sense, one could argue that our state policies are not keeping up with the growth that we're sort of seeing through the census. There is a real need to rethink that. If you think about our rural communities, many of these communities that are losing residents, it absolutely is a challenge. And so that's going to require a whole new way of thinking about how we think about rural development in the state, which means thinking about the infrastructure types of development. It's going to require much more sharper economic development initiatives. And so, as we think about the support in rural communities, it's going to be, unfortunately, having to think about what are the types of industries that we're investing in. Are we picking winners and losers and making those types of investments as well? So we are seeing, I think, a tale of two Texases. And the question really is how do we get the pro-growth policies in place that can continue to facilitate the growth that's necessary on the metro and urban side, but how do we triage and think about the challenges and the growths that are happening in our rural communities? We could argue that remote work maybe throws a bone to some of this in terms of rural communities. That's been a lot of the practice and space that others have thought about. But it's very much a challenge, and it's one that I think that I don't think we're talking enough about in the state of Texas. We keep talking about the growth of across the Texas as, and you see this a lot from our elected leaderships. We're best place for business, but Texas is not monolithic. It is not one. It's very homogeneous when you think about the growth that's happening here. And so I think it's going to require us to be a little bit more, I hate the word sophisticated, but a little bit much more targeted in our policies to address those issues. I rambled a bit, but hopefully answered your question. Yeah. That's right. Which means 90% of our legislature represent metro areas. We also had something about new model for governance. What would that look like? Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I'm actually working on some thinking about this now. So yes, we could argue that unfortunately, I've said this a lot, and I'm on record for saying it. And so I don't mean to be overly political at a regional event, but hell, I'm on the record for saying it already on many national outlets. Is that unfortunately what's happened in Texas is the metropolitan and urban voice across our state has been gerrymandered to hell, right? We have been sliced and diced and over and over and over, and that continues to happen, and unfortunately it happened again. And so, until Metro Texas comes out and wins a statewide election and changes the demographics of our changes the dynamics at the statewide politics, I think that will continue to happen and potentially continue to happen over the next few years. So I think that's a reality. Secondly, I think one of the things that has been fascinating to me about Texas, and this is a hypothesis, and I'd love to get your thoughts or reflections on this. I kind of outlined this in the Times. I pitched this as a book idea, actually, is that one of the things that's interesting about our state is that we have had a fairly coalition-driven types of governance in our state, if you look over the history of Texas, even as we've been gerrymandered. And that means that the public and the private sector have been at the table, working together. And not always agreeing, and obviously there's issues with that, and sometimes we can argue that there's externalities that are created with that. But one could look at over the course of the last couple years as our state's accelerated and as politics across our state and other places across the country have become more partisan, that we've lost that coalition building. And so what is and was a very interesting growth model for the rest of the country in terms of the way that we thought about growth, public and private at the table, has been a bit thrown out the window. Now, not in organizations there are organizations that are doing great work on the ground like this, but from a sort of 50,000 foot state level. And so the question would argue that a new growth model would say, let's get back to that. I don't know that it's a new growth model, much as maybe a return back to that. I think it's also just a return back to the idea that, in my mind, and I get killed by my progressive friends for sure. I got beat up yesterday on Twitter about this as well. Is that growth model of as I wrote in the monthly, of letting Beaumont be Beaumont, Central Texas be Central Texas, Houston be Central Houston, I think is really important because, as mentioned earlier, our state is not monolithic. There are challenges in rural communities. Texarkana faces completely different challenges than Austin, and frankly hold different values. We're a state of 29 million people. And so this multi-diverse way, sort of local focus, hyper-local focus, engaged public-private sector engagement is something that was unique to us. It's something that I would argue, and it has lots of challenges. I'm not to say that it's perfect, but it's something I would encourage us to think more about and try to get more back to doing. So that's my thought.
Hi. Healthcare in the state is sort of bizarre to me because you have rural hospitals closing at an alarming rate, but yet Texas is also known for having world-class healthcare and cutting-edge research on that in Houston and Dallas. Is anyone talking to them about how to stem the tide? I mean, we all know we need to expand Medicare, but
so let's just do it and stop talking about it.
Right. Other than that, is anyone talking to like MD Anderson or some of these other places in Houston and Dallas about how we can expand healthcare in our rural parts of the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I know that many of the Texas Medical Center in Houston has done a lot around anchor engagement, particularly in communities and trying to extend care throughout Harris County, and thinking about their footprint. And maybe there's some best practices there. I mean, I would even get so back to just saying if we know that here's one of the interesting things. So we know that we can transform communities through meds and eds. We know that. There's textbook examples of this all over the country where that can happen, where you can transform smaller communities by making investments in the local services that they need. Higher the knowledge-based services. We know that they can create better jobs. We know that they can create access to family wages and all those types of things. And by the way, address the issues that we face in terms of healthcare and hospital closings in our communities. And so, if we're thinking through coming out of a pandemic, one of the most logical things would be to think about how you access and utilize healthcare, particularly healthcare anchors, community healthcare anchors, as a way to create opportunity in rural communities. I don't know that that's happening, and I'm not sure I'm not close enough to folks that are in that arena to think about that work, but we know that can be a way to create opportunity in smaller communities. And so, that is, if you're talking to the legislature, you're talking to your policymakers, that's absolutely something we should be. We should be expanding Medicare to take those dollars to invest back in rural communities, which creates better healthcare and health outcomes, and also creates jobs and opportunities. And by the way, creates community hubs, right? We know healthcare and education institutions can be community hubs as well. Yeah, please.
What do you envision as the role of transportation at local, regional, and statewide scales in the future of Texas?
You notice I didn't even talk about transportation. We didn't have a whole talk about transportation.
I did notice that.
Yeah, no. It's hugely important, right? I mean, look, we're all experiencing the growth challenges of not having a significant regional transit system in our city. I tell my students, in 2001, I was a college senior when we lived in Austin, when we first voted down the light rail initiative here. And if you follow that history, it's also an interesting year because it's the same year that Denver, Colorado voted for transit. And not to say that Denver's become the most equitable place, they face some challenges as well, but they've been able to manage their growth in a way that hasn't been just completely horizontal, that has been able to think about how they use their regional transit system to think about nodes on the outside. And so transit's extremely important. And thank goodness that we're making the investment in Project Connect as a region. We know that there's externalities that come with that. I applaud that we will do things that – the one thing that I can say about our transit investment here in Central Texas is that when other communities did not get out in front of the potential of displacement that's going to come with a system like that, we are one of the first regional transit systems that will lead with a displacement fund to address the externalities of that development, whereas places like Denver and Seattle and others had to retrofit that. But it's significantly important. And even though that we are in a pandemic and less us will spend less time in the car, maybe because we're spending a couple days work, we still need a regional transit system to address our affordability issue. You cannot address affordability in a region of our size that's we added the entire District of Columbia, right, in 10 years to our region. And so you're running on a treadmill. You can't address those affordability issues without transit, and think about how you're going to deal with the affordability and the growth and the externalities of just the externalities of that without the investments in transit. So much more important. I mean, one of the things that I think that we should take the governor for his word is even Governor Abbott has bought into the idea that transportation and transit matters, right? And getting away from the idea of continuing to think about highway building as well. And so it's hugely important. I would also say the last thing about transit is that we can't just invest in transit without updating land use codes. So if one of our city council members here, if Austin doesn't adjust its land use codes, it has ramifications for your communities as well, right? And so it has regional ramifications. And so we've got to think that through. Transit, land use, the three things that matter in a community: capital, talent, and land. And transit is a big piece of that, right?
Okay, 2 more questions.
I've been explaining things to friends out of state from California to New Jersey. And one of the things I've noticed about the recent virus infection is that the high transmission areas are in counties with populations under 10,000 in the entire county. And being curious about that, I went to see how many counties in Texas have less than 10,000 residents. It's 95 out of the 254. They don't have a critical mass to build education and health infrastructure. It's like a neighborhood. So has anybody thought at the legislature about combining them so they could do something with more finances?
That's a really great question. In fact, it's a question that I mentioned my student project at the LBJ school. We're funded through IC Squared and a fantastic organization, foundation, the TL Temple Foundation out of Lufkin, Texas, close to where I grew up. So one of the things that I would argue that, to your question earlier about rural and metro as well, and I'm glad you brought this point up because it sparked this idea for me, is we as Texas and we as metropolitan organizations we as regional groups do a lot of great things about coming together to think about our regional issues, right? We could do more of it, right? We could do more of this. We could do more regional cooperation, getting the public and the private sector together, getting more business leaders in this organization. Not that you all are in business, but getting more of our company and enterprise leaders in these organizations as well. And so metro and regions have done this for a long time and have a history of doing this for lots of reasons. Rural communities don't do this very well. And rural communities face the challenge that not only do they not have density, but they also have the real issue of being remote. So when you don't have density and capacity, you don't have density in terms of scale and numbers, and you're also remote, that means that you have to think differently. And so one of the things that I would submit to you is that if we're wanting to think about rural Texas and the declining of populations in rural Texas and reimagining rural economies, there is the need to let's get our rural communities to do exactly what you guys are doing. Better planning, come together, think about scale, opportunity, think more regionally. And so that I don't think that happens enough here in the state of Texas. Now, there are institutions that are trying to do more of that. The Temple Foundation's funded a lot of that work in East Texas, but they have a footprint that's very concentrated. They care about just deep East Texas. And so can we take some of the lessons learned of other places, and not to say it's perfect there, but to say, are there lessons that can be learned from these communities and apply those elsewhere? That's a real big issue, I think, as we look across the state, is thinking through this question of how do we encourage, how do we incentivize communities to think more through planning and connecting those rural communities to each other. And then also, I think, connecting rural communities to metro economies. There is this false number I hear in the state of Texas that is, what's good for metros is bad for rural, and what's good for rural is bad for metros. I think we all share shared interests, actually, in infrastructure, the types of workforce development we do, how we think about how we build communities, the need for healthcare. And so one of the things that I think that we as community leaders and regional groups have to do as we're thinking about these issues, both metro and urban and rural, is to ask this question, rather than having policy leaders divide us and say what's good for rural versus metro, rather than that, saying we actually share a growth agenda that's actually pretty in a sense, has a lot of shared principles here, and trying to advance those growth principles in our legislature, and getting our private sector leaders to get on board with that as well. I think that's the real question, is this more of this cooperation. Thanks for your question. Sure.
Yeah, question here, and then you have the last question.
Good morning. I just wanted to sort of acknowledge and thank you for your comment that public health and economic health cannot be divorced. As a matter of fact, I would encourage you to put that on a t-shirt and go to a public health conference. Your retirement is locked up. But I was curious in your research, as you looked at that public health thought process, did you see among business a shifting of perspective? Because, for example, during the pandemic, we have said, the simple thing of stay home when you're sick. Well, that works really well if you're a person whose paycheck's not going to be short when you stay home. Doesn't work so well for folks who have the other scenario. So I am looking for a shifting of thought around paid sick leave, for example. Have you seen some of that?
Unfortunately, the answer to that, obviously, I think in the near term, for me, I haven't seen a shift of that, if I'm just being frank and honest with you. I think, I'll say a couple thoughts on that. I think one is that I live in my bubble of being an economic developer. It's what I do every day. It is the, people say, oh, you're a faculty professor at UT. No, bullshit, I'm a city builder. I do economic development. And as an economic developer, I will say, I actually, and I say this naively, is that prior to the pandemic, I don't think I ever personally thought about the ramifications of public health and economic development together, until we started looking at how policy decisions were being made, public health policy decisions were being made economic development decisions or economy decisions were being made. And where the light kind of went off for me is just that how divorced the two were, right? And I think that was the public health folks not talking to public health, and local officials on the economic development side generally not thinking about that. And I think one of the lessons that came out of this for me is that you can't actually build healthy economic resilient economies without thinking the ramifications of what that means from a health perspective as well. So for me, that was a personal sort of learning that the light bulb sort of went off. I will say that as I've done starting to do more of these types of conferences and working with more and more cities, I think the thing that is helpful is when workforce developers and economic developers and city builders and city council members are starting to say, public health really does matter to the economic vitality. And we start to communicate that narrative. I think that we're in the early stages of coming out of a pandemic and wanting to say that, starting to say that narrative over and over. And so it's going to require more of advocacy work for us, for people like you and I who do this type of work, who are working with cities and maybe even engaging with companies around their strategies to keep reiterating that point. Because hopefully we do get to a point where we actually realize that, that we do need a paid sick leave in this country. That it isn't actually, it is challenging for locally. I'm not to say it's not challenging for small businesses, but maybe as we think about the investment in the public goods, right? Think about this. We as a community across federal, state, local regions, we do a ton of investment in infrastructure, physical infrastructure. But we haven't necessarily done enough investment in the people infrastructure, right? And if the one thing we take out of the pandemic, particularly as all the stuff that I put on the board here, coming out of this and thinking about equity, is that transit and roads and housing and land use really matter, but it's also the investment back in people. That's skills, that's good jobs, but it's also investing to ensure people have the health care and the health to ensure they can actively participate. I mean, the reason that you look at the jobs report that came out today, it's a good jobs report, but there's still a lot of people sitting on the sidelines. And why are they sitting on the sidelines? Well, if I was a service-based worker that's making less than $15 an hour, I'm concerned about my health. I've got my kids at home. I don't know that I would actually want to be I'm not sure that I would want to be going out and exposing myself to that type of work. And so there is these questions about ensuring that as we talk about healthcare and we talk about economic development, that we're doing a better job of marrying the two together. So just some thoughts. Thank you all. One more question.
Sorry. What role do nonprofits play in economic development, and what are some examples of the ones that are leading the charge?
Huge. Most of you probably are from nonprofit organizations, right? And I guess when I talk about this model of public and private in Texas, I actually kind of a lot of times group all these private or nonprofit organizations in the private sector. I sort of think of it in a way. I mean, look, I think nonprofits are hugely important in terms of playing the role that they do. There are intermediaries in a state like Texas that values limited government. Much of the work that we would expect that would happen in a place like New York City or places in California and other communities gets essentially exported to your organizations to do workforce development, skill development, health, all those types of things. So extremely important. Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but very much a part about a key player in that ecosystem for sure. And I think that's a part that maybe is uniquely Texan in the things that we do here is how active our nonprofit and our foundation sector play here in terms of our civic governance. Thank you for that question. Great, y'all. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Wonderful day.
Thank you.